Good evening. I hope everybody can hear me okay. You know, I know that some of you out there are thinking that I look like I'm overweight. But I'll have you know, according to the charts, I'm the exact weight that I should be for a 6 foot 3 inches tall. I'm not overweight, I'm under tall. I was told that if I eat my vegetables, I can lose weight. So I've been eating pumpkin pie and zucchini bread, carrot cake, all my vegetables. But it doesn't work too well. But you know, my idea of a balanced diet is a cookie in each hand. That's my idea. But you know, I gave up dessert one time. Oh, it was the worst 20 minutes of my life. You know, I've really given up on the idea of getting back to my original weight. And that's okay, that's okay. After all, 7 pounds, 3 ounces just isn't realistic. But I think I have found out what's causing my increase in my weight. It's the metal fillings in my teeth. You know, those magnets on the refrigerator, they just keep drawing me back in there to that refrigerator all the time. But I got a sign on my refrigerator. It says, "Thou shalt not weigh more than thy refrigerator." And I was on a low-fat diet one time that really did work. And my fat just hung lower than ever. But I read an article the other day that just scared me to death. It was about the dangers of overeating. And I said, that's it. After today, no more reading. You know, there's another idea that I've had about what's causing my weight gain, and I think I have pinpointed it. It's my shampoo. Now, it says right on the label, you know, when I take a shower, I shampoo my hair, and all that shampoo goes right down my body. And it says right on the label, you need to read the label, folks. It says right on there for full body and big volume. I said, there it is, that's it, that's what's causing it. So I've switched. I'm using Dawn dish soap now. It says right on the label, cuts fat. One time when I was on a diet, I was driving down the street and I came across one of these Krispy Kreme donut places, you know, with the light flashing hot. And I thought to myself, you know, that could be God's way of rewarding me for being good on my diet. But I didn't want to take any chances. So I said, God, I made a pact with God. I said, God, if you really want me to have donuts, you let there be a parking space right in front of the door. And you're not going to believe this. 5th time around the block, parking space right there in front of the door. I was down at Kroger the other day buying Purina dog chow for my Fido, the prize-winning dog that I have. And I was in line to check out. And the lady standing behind me, she says, "Do you have a dog?" And I thought, what a stupid question is that? So I turned around to her and I said, "No, ma'am, I don't have a dog." I said, "This Purina dog chow's got a lot of vitamins, a lot of minerals, and I just go on a Purina dog chow diet." I said, "I do know the last time I went on that diet, I wound up in the hospital." She said, "Oh, did the dog food make you sick?" I said, "No, ma'am." I said, "On the way home, I stopped to pee on a fire hydrant and got hit by a car." You know, there's a new government study out, and it says it found out that women who carry a few extra pounds live longer than men who mention it. Now, speaking about women, you know, my wife and I, we celebrated our 53rd wedding anniversary this year. And I knew the first time I met her that she was Miss Right. I just didn't know her first name was Always. She asked me, "Where are you from?" I said, "Indiana." She said, what part? I said, all of me. She didn't get that. You want to tell her? You know, when I proposed to her, I'm very romantic. I got down on one knee, and I said, put your clothes in my closet. Put your socks in my drawer. Lay your head on my pillow, but please don't snore. Oh, I was very romantic. We hold hands everywhere we go. If I let go, she goes shopping. Now, the other day, I found a receipt for a dress that she had bought. She paid $300 for that dress. I said, honey, what in the world made you do that? She said, the devil made me do it. He said, I look good in that dress. I said, well, don't you know you're supposed to say, get thou behind me, Satan? She said, I did. He said it looked good back there, too. We were over at Macy's department store the other day in Indianapolis, and we wound up in the bathing suit department. Now, she hadn't bought a bathing suit in 10 years and 20 pounds. She brought out two of them. She had a bikini and an all-in-one. She said, honey, which one of these should I buy? I said, you better buy the bikinis. I don't think you can get it all in one. Now, she has very expensive tastes. I asked her what she wanted for her birthday. She said something with a lot of diamonds in it. So I bought her a deck of cards. It's got a lot of diamonds in it. She had a credit card stolen. I didn't even bother to report it. The guy that stole the card, he spent less money than she did. You know, we never have an argument. We just have intense discussions. But the last fight we had, I didn't see her for 2 or 3 days. And then I could see her just a little bit out of this left eye. I said to her, honey, how can you be so beautiful and so stupid at the same time? She said, let me explain. She said, God made me beautiful so that you would want me, and made me stupid so that I would want you. Now, women generally like that one. We had to go to marriage counseling after that. We went over to the marriage counselor, and she gets up in front of him and she says, I don't think I'm getting enough affection. Well, he gets up from the desk and comes around and gets a hold of her and gives her a great big bear hug and a big smoochy kiss. And he turns around to me and he said, did you see that? And I said, yes, sir. He said, well, she needs that at least 2 times a week. I said, well, I'll try to bring her in on Tuesday and Thursday. I had to cut a trip short the other day and go home because I got a report that she had laryngitis and couldn't speak a word. I didn't want to miss a minute of it. When she was pregnant with our first child, she drugged me off to one of these birthing classes. And the fella, he tells them that they're supposed to do various things before the baby arrives. And one of the things he said can strengthen your muscles is you're supposed to do some walking. And then he said, you husbands, it wouldn't hurt you to go along with your wife. Whoa. Wouldn't hurt you to go along with your wives. So I put up my hand. And I said, is it okay if she carries golf clubs while we walk? My son asked me, he said, Dad, where did we come from? So I explained to him the story of the Bible of creation and told him that God had created Adam and Eve, and we were all sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. And he went off to his mother. Asked her, said, Mom, where did we come from? Well, she told him the story of evolution. Told him we all came from monkeys and apes. He came back to me and said, Dad, what's the difference? I said, well, you know, I told you about my side of the family and she told you about hers. She's always late. You know, her ancestors came over on the June flower. I said, honey, we were getting ready to go someplace. I said, honey, will you hurry up? Are you ready yet? She said, Jack, For crying out loud, I've told you for the last hour, I'll be ready in a few minutes. Well, there was a marriage seminar that we went to, and the fellow said, you need to know everything you can about your spouse. Every little detail that you can learn about your spouse, it's going to be good for your marriage. He said, for example, do you know what your spouse's favorite flower is? So I leaned over to my wife and I said, honey, it's a gold medal all-purpose flower, isn't it? I'm going to sing you a little song about a couple that got married that really didn't know each other very good. We got married last Friday. My girl was right there beside me. Our friends were all gone and we were alone, side by side. We were so happily wed when she got ready for bed then. She put her teeth in her hair and she placed her leg on a chair. One glass eye so tiny, one hearing aid so small. Then she took off that one leg and placed it on a chair by the wall. Oh, I was broken-hearted. Most of my girl had departed. So I slept on the chair. There was more of her there, side by side. Little Johnny that lived across the street from us. Oh, by the way, I should tell you, I was born and raised in a little town. Maybe some of you know where Shelburne, Indiana is, over in Sullivan County. That town's so small that we didn't even have a village idiot. We had to take turns. You know, the city town council, they voted to put in a traffic signal, the only one that we'd have in town, and we never really ever did get it because they couldn't agree on what colors to make the lights. But you know, that town, you could burn down your bathroom and wouldn't even set your house on fire. Rich people, you could tell the ones that were rich, they're the ones that had the two-story outhouses. Little Johnny had lived across the street from us, about 6 years old. And I asked him, I said, are you excited about your mother that's pregnant and going to be having a new baby? He said, oh yes. He said, and I know what they're going to call the new baby. He said, I heard Mommy and Daddy talking. And they said if it is a girl, they're going to call it Suzanne. And if it's another boy, they're going to call it Quits. Miss Porter was taking her elementary school children on a tour down at Mary Sherman Hospital in Sullivan. And the x-ray technician asked Billy Joe, said, did you ever break a bone? He said, yes. He said, did it hurt? He said, no. The x-ray technician said, it really didn't hurt. Said, which bone was it? He said, my sister's arm. We had some very interesting characters in my hometown. We had a lawyer, his name Dewey Cheatham. He bought a new Lexus, took it out and parked it right there in front of his office. He wanted all of his associates to see his new car. When he starts to get out of the car, he opens up the door and along comes a great big dump truck and whoom, takes the door right off. Oh, he just was devastated. He sat there and was cussing and going on and saying that car would never be the same, that the body shops could never make it like new. And as he was going wrong, ranting and raving, somebody called Eddie Nash, who's a state trooper in that town. Eddie came up to him and said, all you lawyers are alike. He said, all you can think about is material things. And Dewey said, how can you say that? He said, well, when that dump truck came by and tore off your door, said it tore off your left arm also. Dewey looked down and said, oh my God, where's my Rolex? Sam Jones lived over at Shady Rest Nursing Home, and he's sitting out on the front porch. And he saw a farmer go by on a tractor pulling a wagon. He said, howdy, and the old farmer said, well, howdy. He said, what's in the wagon? He said, manure. He said, what you gonna do with it? He said, we're gonna put it on the strawberries. He said, why don't you come by here tonight? I said, they put whipped cream on them here. Now, Earl and Edna Daniels, they always went to the county fair every year, and they had airplane rides over there that they charged $55 to take you up for an airplane ride. And Edna always told Earl, said, no, 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 $55 is $55, and that's just too much. Well, the pilot overheard them talking, and he said, I'll tell you what, folks. Said, if I'll take you up for a ride, and it won't cost you the $55, it'll be free. If neither one of you say one word, said, I don't want to hear one sound out of either one of you. So Edna says, well, free is good, let's go. So they got into the airplane and off they went. And he no more got up into the air, and he started doing barrel rolls and acrobatic moves and over and around and around. Finally he landed. And whenever he landed, he said, well, you folks really did surprise me. I thought sure when I started doing all those acrobatic moves that somebody would have said something. Earl said, well, I almost did when Edna fell out, but $55 is $55. Sam and Mary Britton went on a cruise. Now, you know these cruises, you eat in the same restaurant every night, and you have the same table, and the nice thing about it is you meet new people, and they sit at the table, and various couples, and you get to know them over the week. Well, one night, one of the fellows at the table bit down on some food and broke his plate. And he was just moaning and groaning, saying, oh, you know, the best thing about the cruises is the food, and here I am with a broken plate I'm not going to be able to eat. The fellow across the table from him reached down his pocket, pulled one of the plates out and handed it to him and said, here, try this. And he put it in and tried it and said, oh, it's too big. He reached in his pocket and got a second one, brought it out and said, here, try this one. He put it in his mouth and said, oh, that's too small. He reached in his pocket and got a third one, gave it to him and said, try this one. He put it in his mouth and he said, oh, that fits good. He said, that's perfect. I said, what's the odds that I'd come on a cruise and break a plate and have a dentist right on my table? He said, oh, I'm not a dentist, I'm an undertaker. Ed Schroyer was having a problem with his hearing, and he went to the doctor, and the doctor fitted him with some real nice hearing aids, and he asked Ed to come back about a month now and have him checked. So he did. He came back, and the doctor said, well, how's the hearing aids? He said, oh, wonderful. Said, I have 100% hearing now. He said, well, your family must really appreciate you getting new hearing aids and be able to hear. He said, oh, I didn't even tell them. He said, I just sit around and listen to them talk about me. He said, I've changed my will 3 times. 80-year-old Lily Parker getting married for the 4th time. Sullivan Times newspaper thought that was newsworthy, so sent up a reporter to interview her. And the reporter came in and said, Lily said, what was the careers or what was the jobs that your previous husbands had? She said, well, when I was 20, I married a banker. She said, when I was 40, I married a circus ringmaster. And when I was 60, I married a preacher. And now that I'm 80, I'm going to marry an undertaker. So it's 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready, and 4 to go. Janice Turley fixed up her 80-year-old grandmother on a blind date with a 95-year-old man. She came home from the date all shook up. She was just beside herself. Janice said, well, what happened? She said, I had to slap him 3 times. She said, well, did he get fresh? She said, no, I thought he was dead. They had a birthday party for Frank Shipman on his 103rd birthday. And they said, Frank, do you think you'll be around for your 104th birthday? He said, absolutely. Said statistics show that very few people die between 103 and 104. Tom Asbury asked his grandfather, he said, what's the secret of long life? His grandfather told him, he said, what you do is you take a pinch of gunpowder and you put it in your oatmeal every morning. And you know, Tom did that faithfully, and he lived to be 105 years old. And when he died, he left 5 children, 10 grandchildren, 15 great-grandchildren, and a 20-foot hole where the crematorium used to be. You know, I came from a family of long livers. I had an uncle who lived about that long. Jim Bush applied for Social Security when he turned 65. He went into the office and the gal asked him, said, did you bring your birth certificate to prove that you were 65? And he said, oh no, so I forgot it. I can go home and get it. She said, oh no, that's not necessary. He said, why don't you just unbutton the buttons on your shirt? So he did, and she said, well, I can see from those gray hairs on your chest, you're bound to be over 65. So she gave him Social Security. Well, he went home and told his wife. She said, honey, if you'd have dropped your pants, you might have got disability. Arthur and Ellen, they both had homes in Pine Ridge Retirement 55-plus community, and they had a lot of activities there. In fact, about every Wednesday night, they had one of these pitch-in suppers, you know, potluck supper. And Arthur, he got at the same table where Ellen was sitting, right across from her, and he looked over at the table and finally got up just enough courage. And he said, Ellen, would you marry me? And she said, oh yes, I'll marry you. Well, after the dinner was over, they went to their separate homes, and it bothered Arthur all night long. He couldn't remember, and she said yes, or did she say no? Well, the first thing in the morning when he woke up, he got on the telephone, and he called up Ellen, and he said, Ellen, you know, it was so good to be with you in the dinner last night. But so when I asked you to marry me, he said, did you say yes, or did you say no? She said, oh, I said yes, and I really meant it. And I'm so glad you called, because I couldn't remember who it was that asked me. Sarah Woodsmall, she went to the doctor, and she told the doctor, I don't know what to do sometimes. Said, my husband, said, he loses his temper and he gets so angry, and said, I get afraid of him. The doctor said, oh, I got a cure for that. Said, what you do is you get, when he gets all agitated that way, so what you do is you get a glass of water, and you get that and you take some sips of that water and put it in your mouth, and you start swishing that water back and forth until he either settles down or leaves the room. Well, she came back to the doctor a little later and said, I'm amazed. She said, you know, that swishing really works. I said, what is it about that swishing that works? Doctor said, well, so the swishing really doesn't have anything to do with it. I said, what works is keeping your mouth shut. You know, there was a busload of politicians out on Highway 48. They were going around a curve a little too fast and went over the cliff. And they landed over there in Roscoe's pasture. And Roscoe goes and gets his backhoe, digs a big hole, and buries them all. Next day the sheriff came out. Said, Roscoe, did they have a busload of politicians come around here and went off and landed in your pasture? He said, yes, sir. He said, well, what'd you do with them? He said, I buried them. He said, well, were they all dead? He said, oh, some of them said they weren't, but you know how politicians lie. My family attended the Church of God there over on Maple Street. Pastor Simpson got a call one day from the Internal Revenue Service. And they said, do you know Walter Thompson? He said, I do. He said, is he a member of your church? He said, he is. He said, did he contribute $20,000 to your church? He said, he will. Bertha Lundy, she's the organist at our little church. She invited the pastor over to her house for tea. And he came in sitting in the parlor, and she said, "You sit here and I'll go in the kitchen and prepare your tea." Well, while she was off in the kitchen, he's looking around the parlor and he sees her organ sitting over in the corner. And lo and behold, sitting on the organ was a glass bowl full of water, and floating on top of it was a condom. And he thought, "My Lord, what's that?" So she comes back in and he says, "Can you explain this?" She says, "Oh, yes." So that's the most wonderful thing. She says, "I was out walking the other day on a path and said I looked down and there was a little package. And I picked it up and I read on it. It said, 'Put on the organ, keep moist, and will prevent disease.'" And she said, "You know, I haven't had the flu all winter." Pastor Simpson asked the church council if they would put a new chandelier in the sanctuary. And so the church council voted on it, and they voted it down. And they said there's 3 reasons. So number 1, we don't think the secretary can spell chandelier for the minutes. And number 2, we don't think anybody in church can play one. And number 3, we think the money would be better spent to improve the lighting in the sanctuary. Pastor Simpson had all his teeth pulled, and his gums just hurt him terrible. He got new dentures. And the first Sunday he was back to church, he preached about 10 minutes and sat down because they were hurting him so bad. Well, the next Sunday, they weren't hurting quite as bad, and he preached about 20 minutes and sat down. Third Sunday he gets back and he preaches an hour and a half. Somebody said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, I'm a little embarrassed." He said, "By accident I got a hold of my wife's false teeth." You didn't get that? He got a hold of his wife's false teeth, so he preached an hour and a half. Hazel Kimmel was a spinster. She was an old maid in our church. She left specific instructions with the pastor on how to have her funeral. She said, "I don't want any male pallbearers." She said, "They wouldn't take me out when I was alive, and they're not going to take me out when I'm dead." You know, Blanche Oaks, she came to our kitchen suppers that we had there at the church. She always brought the prettiest pies. I said, "Blanche, how in the world do you make those pies so pretty?" She said, "Oh, I can't tell you." I said, "That's a secret." I said, "Oh, come on, Blanche, you can tell me." I said, "I won't tell anybody." She said, "Well," "what I do is I take that pie pan and I take that dough and I put it down in the pie pan and I trim the edges around that pie pan all the way around real even. Then," she says, "I take my fruit filling and I put it in there, and then I put another pie dough over the top and I trim it around the edges real even. Then," she said, "I take my false teeth and I crimp that all the way around the edge." She said, "It makes a real pretty pie." Troy LaRosa was a ex-con that attended our church, and he had been in prison, and he died, and his brother came down from Chicago to make funeral arrangements to talk to Pastor Simpson. And he told the pastor, he said, "During the funeral, if you'll call my brother a saint, I'll donate $20,000 to the church." And Pastor Simpson took him up on the offer, and it surprised everybody. He gets up during the funeral, and he says, "Tony was a real mean dude, but compared to his brother, he was a saint." One day I saw a man, out behind the church there was a cemetery, a Little Flock Cemetery. And it was located behind the church, and I used to go over there and read some of the inscriptions that were on the tombstones. And I saw one day that said, "Pause, stranger, as you pass by, for such as you are now, so once was I. But as I am now, you soon shall be. So prepare for death and follow me." And somebody had scribbled down on the bottom of the tombstone, "To follow you, I'll not be content until I know which way you went." One day I saw a man down in front of a tombstone. He was just crying his eyes out. He was saying, "Why did you have to die? Why did you have to die?" I came up to him and I said, "Was it your wife?" He said, "No." "Why did you have to die? Why did you have to die?" I said, "Well, was it one of your parents?" He said, "No." "Why did you have to die? Why did you have to die?" I said, "Well, was it one of your children?" He said, "No." "Why did you have to die? Why did I said, "Well, who was it?" He said, "It was my wife's first husband." I said, "Why did you have to die? Why did you?" You know, one Halloween night I went over by, I was just a small shaver, and I was going to prove how brave I was, and I walked by the cemetery on Halloween night. And as I was walking by, I heard something behind me going, bop, bop, bop. And I looked back, and it was a casket had come out of the cemetery and was following me. So I started running, and I heard behind me, bop, 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 bop. So I got home, and I opened the door, and I ran up the stairs, and I heard behind me, boppity, 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 bop. And I ran into the bathroom, and I grabbed the first thing I could get my hands on. It was a bottle of cough syrup, and I threw it at it. And you know what happened? It stopped the coughing. You know, it's hard to understand how cemeteries can raise their rates and blame it on the cost of living. One year I bought my mother-in-law a burial plot out that cemetery for Christmas. The next Christmas I didn't give her anything. She said, "Why not?" I said, "You didn't use what I gave you last Christmas." There was an old man that was upstairs laying on his deathbed, and he smelled the aroma of chocolate chip cookies wafting up the stairs. And he thought to himself, you know, my wife knows that chocolate chip cookies are my favorite cookie, and she is showing one last act of love by making me a batch of chocolate chip cookies. So he crawled out of bed, and real easily he crawled over to the stairs and made his way downstairs, and when he got down to the bottom, he looked over at the dining room table, and it was spread out all over there with chocolate chip cookies. And with the last ounce of strength, with a shaking hand, he reached up for one and popped right across his wrist with a spatula. His wife said, "Leave those alone, those are for the funeral." You know, in our hometown we had a funeral home. It was called the McClure Funeral Home, and it was owned by a couple of twins. Their names were Mel, Melvin, and Malachi. And we called them Mel and Mal. One day there was a semi-truck backed up to the front door of the funeral home and unloaded a great big load of embalming fluid, box after box of it. Mel's wife came out and saw it all sitting there in the lobby, and she said, "We can't have this." Said, "Customers coming in here and all these boxes." Said, "You guys got to hide these things." Said, "Put them in the closet, put them in the cabinets, and get rid of them." So Mel started putting them away, and he got about halfway done, and he stopped. She said, "Well, what about the rest of them?" He said, "Oh, those are formaldehyde." Now, somebody explain that to him. You know what formaldehyde is? That's embalming fluid. At the end of the funeral, Mary Sue Johnson, they were carrying her out. The undertakers had the pallbearers carrying her out, and they accidentally hit a wall. And they heard a moan inside the casket. And they opened up the casket, and Mary Sue was still alive. And she lived for 10 more years. And when she did finally die, they had her funeral in the same place. And the pallbearers this time were carrying her out. And her husband yelled out, "Hey, you guys, don't forget about that wall." He didn't want her coming back again. There were 2 different famous people in my little hometown that died this past year. One of them was Elmer Horowitz. He was the guy that wrote that famous song, "The Hokey Pokey." Well, when they went to prepare him for the funeral, everything just went fine until they tried to put him in the casket. And they'd put his right foot in, he'd put his right foot out. They'd put his left foot in, he'd put his... And the other guy was Roger Harrison. He was that famous inventor. He invented the television remote control. And at his request, he was buried between two large sofa pillows. We had a lot of kids that attended our church. Bobby asked the pastor one day about a plaque that was out in the lobby of the church. He said, "What is that?" And the pastor said, "Well," so that's what we have up there, that plaque is to honor those that died in the service. Bobby said, "Which service? First service or second service?" Johnny was sick one Sunday, and his mother said, "I don't know if you should go to church or not. Your stomach hadn't been well, and you've been vomiting." And he said, "Oh, Mommy," said, I'll be okay." So when they got to church, got out of the car, she came across from the curb to the sidewalk, a little grassy spot, and she said, "If you feel like you're going to vomit, you get up and you run out here and you do it right there. Don't you dare throw up in church." So about halfway through the service, little Bobby, he punches his mother and he said, "Mommy, I think I'm going to have to throw up." She said, "Well, get going." So he ran down the aisle and he was gone for a little while. Pretty soon he came back in, sit down beside his mother, and she said, "Well, did you make it outside?" He said, "I didn't have to." So I got out there to the lobby and they got a box out there, the sign on says, "For the sick." The kids were drawing Bible characters in the Sunday school, and little Susie, teacher came around and said, "What are you drawing, Susie?" And he said, "God." His teacher says, "Susie, don't you know that nobody knows what God looks like?" She said, "They will when I get finished." Mother went into her son's bedroom to get him up to go to church. And he said, "I don't want to go." She said, he said, "I'll give you two good reasons." He said, "One, those people don't like me, and two, I don't like those people." She said, "Well, I can give you two good reasons why you should go." He said, "You're 39 years old, and you're the pastor." Billy's mother asked him what he learned in Sunday school, and he said, "We learned this morning what God's first name is." She said, "Well, what is it?" He says, "It's Andy." "Andy?" He said, "Yeah. You've heard of Andy walks with me, Andy talks with me, and he tells me that he's mine." There was a drought one summer over home. It got so bad that there wasn't hardly enough water for the churches to baptize. The Baptists, they were sprinkling. The Methodists were using wet wipes. The Presbyterians were giving rain checks. And the Catholics were praying that the wine would turn back to water. Oh, it was bad. It was bad. Charlie was an unbeliever and attended the church, but he just said he was an unbeliever. Pastor Simpson was having a baptism service one day and looked over and saw Charlie sitting there and said, "Come here, Charlie, get in this baptism in water." So Charlie got in. Pastor Simpson took him, put him down under the water and brought him up. He said, "Do you believe?" He said, "No." So he put him back down under the water again, brought him up, said, "Do you believe now?" He said, "No." So Pastor Simpson put him down for the third time, and he held him down a little bit longer. He said, "Do you believe?" He said, "Yes." He said, "What do you believe?" He said, "I believe you're going to drown me." You know, I love stories that play on words. Some people call them puns. Other people call them groaners. But does anybody remember Peekaboo Street that was the downhill skier in the Olympics a few years ago? Well, she works in a big hospital now in the intensive care unit. But they have forbid her to answer the phone because it confuses people whenever she says, "Peekaboo, I see you." When they had the Olympics down in Rio not too long ago, there was 3 guys down there that wanted to go to the games, but they didn't have a ticket. So the Scotsman, he went out and he got a manhole cover and put it under his arm. He went up to the ticket booth. He says, "MacDougall, discus, Scotland. And they let him in. And then an Irishman came up, and he found a rail off the top of the fence, put it over his shoulder, went up to the ticket office and said, O'Malley, Ireland, javelin, and they let him in. Englishman, he went out and he looked all around, and he finally found a roll of barbed wire, put it under his arm, went up to the ticket office, said, Smith, England, fencing. Do you ever read bumper stickers? I got a brand new bumper sticker. It says, honk if you like peace and quiet. You know, when I was a child, my mother used to spank me, but only on my right butt. And I always wondered why. Years later, I found out she was way ahead of her time, because when George W. Bush got to be president, he got Congress to pass a law about that. You've all heard of it. No child's left behind. In our town, we had a lady by the name of Dunn, and Mrs. Dunn heard that I was going to go to New York City. She said, my son went to New York over a month ago, and I haven't heard from him. So when you get to New York, could you look up my son and tell him to please call home? I want to hear from him. I said, what's your son's name, ma'am? She said, John. I said, okay, John Dunn. So I get to New York, and I get over there on Times Square, and I look up, and there's a building with a big sign across it. It says, Dunn and Bradstreet. I thought, well, how easy is this going to be? So I walked into the building, went right up to the receptionist. I said, do you have a John in here? She says, yeah, down that hall, third door on the right. So I went down there, and I opened the door, and there was a guy coming out of a stall. I said, are you done? He said, yes. I said, call home. Your mother wants to talk to you. There was this couple in our town that didn't get along very good, and the husband, he went out and bought a great big insurance policy on his wife. Then he went looking for somebody to kill her. And he went looking for somebody and finally found this guy, this thug by the name of Artie. And Artie agreed to do the dastardly deed for $25,000. And the husband said, okay. He said, but I got to have money up front. The husband said, I can't do that. I got to collect off the insurance first before I can pay you. He said, oh, I got to have something up front. So the husband reached in his pocket and pulls out a dollar bill. And he hands it to Artie, and Artie rolls his eyes and said, well, okay. So the next day over at Kroger in the produce department, Artie sees the man's wife, and he goes up to her, and he puts his hands around her throat, and he chokes her to death. And while he's doing that, the produce manager comes in and sees him. Well, Artie didn't want to leave any witnesses, so he went over to him, and he put his hands around his neck, and he choked him and killed him as well. Well, there's all these cameras, the security cameras all over the place, and they recorded exactly what went on, and it just wasn't very long till the police had Artie behind bars. And during the interrogation, Artie admitted and confessed that he had been hired by this husband and how much he had paid him to kill his wife. Well, the next day, the headline read on the newspaper, artichokes, 2 for $1 at Kroger. You know, the churches out in Las Vegas, they get these gambling chips in their offering plates on Sunday, particularly the Catholic churches. There was a lot of those in Las Vegas. Well, the Protestant churches, they had trouble trying to get all those things sorted out and taken out and cashed in at the various casinos, but the Catholics, they solved the problem. What they did is they took all the chips from all the churches and sent them out to the edge of town where there's a monastery. And they had the monks out there. They would count them and separate them out. And then on Tuesday morning, they would send a guy out to the various casinos to cash them in. And you know what he was called? The chipmunk. There was this lion out in the jungle that saw this bull, and he killed the bull, ate the whole bull, ate the whole thing. And he was so happy with himself that he just roared and roared and roared, and a big game hunter heard him. And he went over there and shot him and killed him. Now the moral of the story is this: if you're full of bull, keep your mouth shut. There was this African tribal chief, and he loved thrones. He had thrones that were carved out of wood, some out of silver, some out of ivory, some gold. He had so many of them, he had to build a second story on his grass hut to store those thrones up there. One day he was sitting downstairs on his throne just enjoying himself, and one of those thrones up above crashed through the ceiling and hit him in the head and killed him. Now the moral of the story is this: people that live in grass houses shouldn't stow thrones. Did you get it?
I did. Yeah, we got it.
This girl that was pregnant had twin babies and she wasn't married, so she put them up for adoption. They sent one of the little boys over to Egypt and they named him Amal, which is a common name in Egypt. And the second one they sent over to Spain and they named him Juan, which was a common name in Spain. Well, about 25 years later, Juan tried to contact his birth mother. And he finally found her and he sent her a letter and sent her a photo. And when she got it, she opened it up, she read the letter, and she looked at the photo and she burst out crying. Her husband came up and said, "What's the matter?" She said, "Oh," said, "I would like to see them all." He said, "Honey, don't you know, when you've seen one, you've seen them all." You've been a good audience for the last story here. I'll tell you about the Indian brave that went in to get his first physical. The doctors gave him a very good examination and said, "We give you a clean bill of health, but I did notice one thing. You don't have any nipples." He said, "That's right." He said, "Nobody in my tribe does." He said, "You gotta be kidding." He said, "I've never heard of that." He said, "How many's in your tribe?" He said, 500. He said, "What do they call your tribe?" "The Indianapolis 500.